Hi everyone, I'm back with another Rogue video in Season 5 and I want to talk about the Aerostorms Rogue again. You might have seen this, I've been playing this quite a bit on my stream. I've made a guide for this on Maxroll and for the season start. A lot of people really enjoyed this setup, including myself. I had a really good time leveling with this and I went back now and tried to really min-max this version of a Barrage Aerostorms Rogue. This might seem very familiar to you if you have already played, for example, the Andariel Barrage Rogue. I basically took a similar concept and tried to apply it to Aerostorms and see how far we get. And it turns out it is actually able to do even tier 8 Infernal Hordes. So that's what you see here. This is a pure Aerostorm setup. There is no like Andariels here, for example, and these kind of things. This is just raw crit damage, and it actually ticks for a lot of damage on many targets, as you can see here. It can melt these Lords in tier 8. The boss fight is like, I don't know, 2 minutes or so. Not the fastest, but it works. And I have no trouble clearing anything. So I want to show you what I did with my setup. I went back and tried to min-max this more. And I found out some pretty interesting stuff. I will also put this into the Maxwell guide. Unfortunately, I haven't gotten around to doing this just yet. And I'm about to go and have my trip to Cologne for Gamescom. So in the next few days, I'll be updating. And I'll put another like Barrage version into the Maxwell Aerostorms guide. But I have to say, I was fairly impressed with how far you can go with Aerostorms alone. And eventually I also min-maxed this a little bit more and put in an Andariels into the Aerostorms Rogue and kind of try to combine both effects without going like full Andariels and still kind of stay true to the spirit of the build, because it already plays very much like an Andariels Rogue. This was just kind of like the starter build that I had in mind for people to kind of get to the point to where they play Andariels Rogue. But for people that really like how this feels and looks, it is just very fun to play with Aerostorms, I gotta admit. And in this case, I try to, stick to the core of the setup while also trying to min-max it to the best way possible. And turns out including Andariels is actually the way forward at the end. But it's not really that much better, I would say. But it makes a few things much easier. It gives you like this insane sustain from the life on hit, because you have lots of hits per second on many targets. So it's very hard to die from anything that doesn't one-shot you. And then of course, you just have a bit more damage output. So the Aerostorms guide is here. You can see this. This is what I have been writing up. I have also gave us an update lately, and here's also different variants. So something for leveling, you can check out. This build basically works from the start. We don't have it as a leveling guide itself, but you can play this 1 to 100 if you want. The only two things that you need to get started are the Vengeful aspect and the Aerostorms aspect. You can get both of these from the Codex, just complete 2 dungeons and you can start imprinting. And then a lot of the other stuff is kind of generic or like, typical rogue buffs or something like that. You don't really need them to get started. You can, find your aspects on the way, but those two are basically necessary. And then early game, you can also go with some of this stuff like Elemental Surge Tempers. So I have this here on the weapons, for example, Elemental Surge. This carries you easily into Vol Tier 4 to get off the Aerostorms aspect. And then you can start working towards these uniques and, more optimized versions, including the Mythic one. But the main version that I previously had was mostly based around puncturing enemies for incredible lucky hit, or eventually maybe going to the Heartseeker version with a crossbow in order to use the higher damage per shot that you can have with a crossbow compared to using swords. But there is another way to do this, and this is what I just saw with the Barrage. So I have this here in the planner as well. This is the Aerostorms planner. You can also just click this here and open it and then see the different variants. And in this case, I made a new Barrage variant that is very much based on the Andariel's Rogue Guide with Barrage from MIPI that we have. So I just want to see if I can apply the same principles, and it works really well. So we use Barrage instead. So once you get to the point where you have really good endgame gear and you can sustain just spamming Barrage, you can actually use that as your lucky hit carrier in order to trigger those Aerostorms. Since Aerostorms are capped at only 7 maximum, you kind of cap out at some point anyway with a certain amount of lucky hit. We facilitate this with the Fist of Fate that has a ton of lucky hit and a bunch of attack speed that we can get, for example, from the Starless Sky itself. And then we have the Close Quarters attack speed and then maybe an Advantage Elixir. So you have relatively high attack speed. It's also the high velocity aspect. And you spam quite a lot of Barrage like this, which is a very resource hungry setup. So it's not that easy to get to the point where you can do this. I would say you kind of need a starter skies. I have made this work without starter skies. If you go for 3 jewelry pieces that all have innovation tempers, this passive here, you can get to the point where this works without starter skies ring. But yeah, you need quite some investment, I'd say, outside of this. So it is possible, and even then it's like slightly clunky. There's a way to kind of help us out a little bit with a resource cost reduction roll that you can put on your two-handed weapon before you get starter skies. You can play this, but yeah, you have to do, you know, some little stuff like that. Anyway, the reason to spam Barrage is not because you want to do the damage with Barrage. This is the Arrow Storms rogue. All of our damage is in the Arrow Storms, and our own shots do nothing. So it's mostly just the aspects that you scale flat damage buffs, or like raw damage buffs that affect everything, not just a skill. We don't even invest more ranks into the Barrage. This is only the 3 ranks we get here from the starters. 1 point is enough. We're going to go up here to get the Ricochet chance, and then the Vulnerable. So you make everything vulnerable by default, which is part of the reason why we choose Barrage for this. And the other part is it has a decent amount of lucky hit if you combine all of the arrows. If you have 100% chance to cast Barrage twice, which is easily achievable from tempering all of your weapons, then you get to the point where you shoot 10 arrows every time you cast Barrage, and they all carry a good amount of lucky hit. And if you, for example, shotgun into a boss with all those arrows, then you will easily take out all of your Arrow Storms and everything else, like your crowd control effects from your Temperers or from your Fist of Fate. There's a lot of stuff that you can activate, and this is also how we fuel our energy. Basically everything comes from innovation. So before you have like a really like functional full endgame setup, you might have to be mindful about this, that innovation ranks is what fuels you, and you want to try to go for this. And you also want to try to go for a lucky hit. So again, Fist of Fate, for example, is a really huge deal here. You have alchemical advantage that you can invest into early on, maybe also include more ranks on your amulet, for example. This is nice. I don't have 5 ranks on my amulet. I have like 2 or 3, I believe. And I'm totally fine. The more the merrier, basically. And this just makes it easier to sustain your resources. And again, as I mentioned, try to put a resource roll on your weapon if you have trouble. Even on the ring, you can do that early on. So this is also an option. Now, another reason to use Barrage is that it also is relatively fast. For example, Rapid Fire is way easier to sustain resources with the improved Rapid Fire, but it has a very slow animation, and you don't actually get to really proc that much. You don't really get to, you know, just make the setup work that well. And then there's Pen Shot, which is kind of nice in AoE combat, but not really good on the boss. So it also has a decent amount of lucky hit, but again, not enough really to make this functional on like single target fights. So this is why Barrage is our choice, and it has this great utility as well with the ricochets, just kind of like hitting stuff on its own, and the vulnerable here. While we added, a frequently asked question is, what about the Dark Shroud? It's not on the bar. This is because we have the Umbrus aspect. This goes into every single rogue build ever. Umbrus aspect gives you those Dark Shrouds, and we have a good amount of crit chance here that's going to instantly give you all the shrouds. If you feel like you're a bit scared, especially on hardcore, I recommend whenever you start Infernal Horde, you can put it on your bar, press Dark Shroud once, and then replace whatever skill you replace the Dark Shroud with, and just have those 5 shrouds at the start of a run. So this is a little trick you can use, but outside of that, you automatically trigger them all the time from this here, and you're going to be fine. I have the Poison Trap here as a utility skill. This knocks down enemies, gives us poison effects, so this triggers all of this stuff here, the alchemical advantage in particular. We want the attack speed and the lucky hit here. There's also some damage reduction. You can invest even more points into this if you want to, but I just went with this here. The other option would be the Caltrops, but I just don't really like playing that much with them. But you can go, there's also here the extra crit chance, for example. There's the extra damage taken effect. It is pretty powerful, and one of the main weaknesses of Arrow Storms is the boss damage, where Caltrops does help you the most. But personally, I just kind of like I don't want to play with it very much, and my boss fights are okay. So I went with a Poison Trap, which makes this part way easier. The other option, instead of going for the Poison Trap, would be to use the Poison Smoke Grenade. So this is an upgrade that came in Season 5. You can use the Subverting Smoke Grenade and throw this into a pack sometimes, but then you don't get a cooldown reduction for the smoke, which is also really handy, I gotta say. So I like playing with the cooldown here. So that's another reason to go Poison Trap. However, in the late game variant, when you go all in with Andariels, which is kind of like the strongest version of this, then you don't really mind the you know, poison proc source that much, because Andariels will just give you poisons on everything. But even here, I went with the Poison Trap because we have the Subverting Poison Trap. And again, you can go for the Caltrops, but I kind of just like playing with the Poison Trap way more, so I went for that. So there's like this little tweak here. There's like a few things on the skill tree that change if you're gonna go for the Andariels. In the setup, we have the Call of the Nameless, mainly to get the trick attack ranks. Also really good is the Unstable Elixirs, and those two passives kind of carry this helm here. Trick attacks is incredibly powerful. You see what it does when you have 10 ranks in this. So you get infinite crit chance, and you get an incredible crit damage buff. So especially at the point where you are only relying on arrow storms, this is, it says it's a damage over time effect on the aspects, but it's actually just 4 hits per second. So you get 12 hits per arrow storm total basically. And those hits can crit, and this is why you go all in on those crit effects here. So we have trick attacks. Unstable Elixirs is also another really nice offensive passive. Gives you a huge damage bonus when you press your potion. And you get a bunch of ranks here that you get from the helm, maybe even the neck. If you have a neck like this, Unstable Elixirs, very nice. So you want to try to muscle memory this 10-second potion. Try to, kind of get a feeling for it. For example, when you run the pit, press the potion whenever you find an elite pack. If you fight a boss, press the potion every time it staggers. So this will just kind of give you this huge damage boost here in the end. We have Dash and Shadow Step. They give us some small buff. There's some crit here, for example. We can also like stun, daze, vulnerable stuff with Shadow Step. It's just like nice mobility. You can fly. If you want to go for a bit more like boss damage as well, you can remove one of them. So for example, Dash is optional. In fact, you could probably even just take out, for example, those 3 points here on Rugged. If you're doing a lot of Infernal Hordes on the higher tiers, just straight up invest them into caltrops and then run Dash, Shadow Step for the Horde waves, and then on your skill bar swap out Dash to caltrops without even changing the skill tree and spending this gold all the time and so on. So that's an option if you feel like you want a bit more raw damage here on the bosses. And finally comes the Death Trap. So why is the Death Trap in here? This is mostly to trigger our preparation. In fact, I actually forgot to change this. This should be preparation. So this is our specialization. Instead of the combo points that we have in the standard variant where you just puncture and then sometimes flurry for the attack speed buff, here we go preparation. So similar to the Andariel rogue, we want to spam our barrage, reset our cooldown on the Death Trap, and yeah, the reason is the preparation. Every time we use our Death Trap, we reset all of our skills, and whenever we spend energy, we reset our Death Trap. So there's kind of like a combo here. And in addition to the 15% damage reduction you get from this for 10 seconds, you also get a huge damage buff from the No Witness Paragon node. This was increased in Season 5, and there are also some node changes here to actually make it much more accessible to get this high ultimate skill damage to buff this node. So you can get a 39% damage buff, and this is without any ultimate damage rolls on your gears. This is exclusively from the Paragon nodes that we have around here and our weapon gems. So this is also the reason why we have diamonds in our weapons. So you would think, okay, why not crit or vulnerable damage or so? Diamonds for the ultimate damage. It's not that the ultimate does a lot of damage. The Death Trap doesn't really contribute much, and we don't even like invest into like all of its points, for example. It's only for this No Witness node. And this also means that every 10 seconds you want to get to the point where you have reset your Death Trap and you can cast it again in order to keep this buff and the preparation buff permanently. So how do you do this? Well, by spending a lot of resources and getting a lot of resources back. So our engine, I explained this earlier, we have the innovation, and you can also have tempers here. So for example, here's a trap cooldown reduction temper you can put on a ring. So try to masterwork this up a little bit maybe, and this will help you out. This like just reduces the trap cooldown to something like maybe 40 seconds. If you invest a little bit more, maybe even down to 35 or something like that. And then you just need, you have like 10 seconds that pass anyway, basically. And then you have 25 to 30 seconds left. So 5 to 6 preparation triggers of this 5 seconds reset will just reset your Death Trap entirely. And by spamming a barrage, you'll get there easily. Another question I keep getting very often is, what about Frigid Finesse? How do you trigger this? Well, there is no cooldown view in this setup, but every rogue build runs this anyway, because first of all, this works against staggered bosses. Basically, all of our damage happens during a stagger phase on a boss, on a rogue build, and this is no exception. We stagger the bosses with our crowd control triggers, and then we get this effect. But we also just get freeze anyway, because we have tempers. So you can put this on the pants, like an ideal pants looks like this. You want second wind, another pretty strong passive actually, and the freeze here. So at least one freeze temper I would recommend. Another one that is good to get is stun as well. And you also have the Fist of Fate, that when you don't get a terrible roll on this random crowd control effect, will very often trigger slow, chill, stun, knockdown, whatever. And this also is an incredible tool to stagger bosses quickly. So together with like 1 or 2 of those tempers And then the Fist of Fate, you're gonna stagger bosses fast. And even after they have already had like a staggered phase, you can still get to the next one relatively quickly. And lastly, we have this here. So one word about Second Wind. This is also another reason to run this barrage setup. It makes you much more tanky because we have this passive here. So again, when you spend energy, you gain this barrier. You get a up to 100% barrier. You cannot go above your max life. So 7 ranks is the absolute maximum you want to have. 6 ranks is fine as well. It's a 90% barrier, which you can get just from 3 points. And then like a tempo without any master working crits here, basically allows you to have perma barrier. So 3 seconds is a pretty long time to spend 100 energy on this build. You'll most likely get it roughly every 1.5 seconds or so, maybe up to 2 seconds. So there's a bit of a window here where sometimes you don't have to shoot and you still keep a perma barrier. This makes you very tanky and even allows us to run stuff like Concealed Aspect to get even more damage. Now for the rest of our gear, I mentioned the 2 Aerostorms aspect. It doesn't really matter which one you put where. I just have the Aerostorms here on the weapon and the Vengeful here. I want to try to have them both on the buffed slots. And then I also have high velocity. This gives us extra attack speed, gives us pierces for barrage, so we have a bit more AoE coverage there, which is nice. Retribution aspect. I also like to run with Doombringer here, especially for the tier 8 hordes on hardcore. This is kind of nice to have. And then I just swap in the retribution, like you can just weapon swap on the boss. So I do this a little bit as a try hard variant. If you have a Doombringer, not a bad idea to just be a bit more tanky. And then you want to try to fix, for example, your armor here on the pants. One armor roll is usually fine, especially once you have a Tyrius Might. You can go full skulls. Normal armor roll just caps you, gives you all the res, all of the armor that you need. If you don't have Tyrius Might, then you might have to do a bit of tweaking here with our resistances and maybe get a juicier armor roll, for example, or even armor temper or something like that. But later on, this is totally fine. And the rest is just like a mix of life, dex, some movement speed here on the boots. You want a chance to cast Barrage twice to 100%. We have 1 damage here, but most importantly, the tempers give us most of our damage. The damage per Dark Shroud Shadow is really powerful. You have usually 5 Dark Shrouds, so this roll alone is like 1000+%, and then you have again 500 here, 500 there, 500 here, and so on. So you get to very, very high values of percent increased damage, and I would recommend to go for maybe 1 crowd control temper. The reason to go for that 1 crowd control temper is to buff the close quarters combat passive here. But you can also just go full Dark Shroud. It is plus minus roughly the same anyway. It kind of depends exactly on like your Paragon choices and you know, how much you've masterworked up these stats and so on. Otherwise, just go full Dark Shroud. It's the same chances anyway, and it just always works, and not just against crowd control. Here's our Paragon. It looks like this. We have a 6-board setup with 5 glyphs, and there's a lot of Paragon nodes that are really strong. I showed off the No Witnesses here for the Death Trap. There is also the Cheap Shot node here, so for crowd controlled enemies you get a bonus. Then you have Exploit Weakness. When you hit vulnerable enemies, you get a damage bonus. And lastly, we have the Deadly Ambush. This says it buffs you only crit strikes, but it actually buffs all damage. So as long as they are affected by traps, which is easily achieved with the Poison Trap. So as long as a poison is ticking, you have this Deadly Ambush effect, which is very nice. And also the same goes for the Ambush Glyph. That kind of does the same. And there's also a bunch of other glyphs here that we have. We have Pride. This is just a physical glyph. Also buffs some really nice nodes here on the Cheap Shot board with the damage reduction and the crowd control for our damage scaling. We have the Fluidity glyph here. You want to try to use either Dash or Shadow Step at least once every 6 seconds. This gives you extra energy regeneration, which might be a bit helpful, and also a 10% damage buff. And also you want to try to hit an enemy every 8 seconds at least for the close quarters buff, because else you don't get this damage bonus and the attack speed bonus. So you have to actually Shadow Step, kind of not exactly on cooldown, but Shadow Step once in a while or dash into a pack once in a while in order to get this buff. Here's a control glyph, very powerful, especially because we want to stun or freeze anyway, with the Frigid Fate, for example. And here's a chip glyph, another stacking damage buff that immediately goes to max with all of the Aerostorms that we're doing. Now, lastly, let me talk about the Andariel's variant, which is very similar. So we swap out the cowl here. So you see this, and we also swap out our boots. So the reason why we swap the boots is because here we have the Frostbitten aspect that buffs all of our crit damage, which is nice. But in the case of Andariel's, we also have maybe 1/3 to half of our damage or so coming from the Andariel's, I would reckon. So it's like maybe 50-50. In this case, Frostbitten doesn't buff it, and Noxious Eyes doesn't buff the Aerostorms. So I wanted to kind of keep it at least somewhat even between the two, and I went for Penitent Griefs. We are back in Season 0, guys. Penitent Griefs are actually really strong these days. Give a bunch of crit and also have this extra chill damage effect, tons of movement speed, pretty nice item. So I put this in here. And in case you don't have Terror's Might, you also solve most of our resources pretty easily this way. Because Andariel gives you infinite poison res, this has cold res, and then you can kind of fix the rest with your gems, for example. So there's also a pretty nice perk here. Other than that, most of the skill tree is the same. I mentioned the subverting poison trap change. You want to try to pick up this 1 point here, for example. But yeah, most of the other stuff is very similar. And the Paragon is also pretty much the same. I didn't really do much of a change, just that we swapped out one glyph here. So instead of Pride, we go for Tracker. So this gives you a 40% longer lasting poison, and this actually increases the total damage of the poison as well. So especially for boss fights, for example, which is what I wanted to solve with this Andariel swap, this helps out a ton because this is where you can stack up those poisons from Andariels quite a bit and then shortcut those boss fights while the Arrow Storms still destroys everything else. So the Bright Glyph here is not really that crazy, at least on the secondary effect, so I put it here. The rest of the board is basically the same. And that also concludes this guide. So I have another guide for the standard version with Puncture and Flurry and all that. I already made a video like a few weeks ago about that, but you can also find it here in the Maxwell guide. So go check it out if you want to see the written version. And as I mentioned, I will add the Barrage variant here as well. But for now, maybe before I do that, you can also go check out the Andariel's Rogue that has most of the same synergies with like the No Weaknesses, the Death Trap, the Barrage, and so on. So we also have that here in our build guides. I can also link that basically. It's kind of a hybrid between the Arrow Storms and the Andariel's Rogue, so to say. So we can also just kind of read up Mippy's guide here that explains a lot of the mechanics behind it. That concludes the guide, so hope you enjoyed this. Wish you good luck with the Arrow Storms Rogue. I'll be back for more, and I'll see you guys next time.